I think it's pretty egregious what's been happening to us the last few games. A minus 31 free throw discrepancy. And I might be able to understand it if we were just chucking threes, but we're not. We're attacking the rim. And the disrespect right now for our team has been pretty unbelievable.
The purpose of the WNBA playoffs is to highlight the top teams, but the Indiana Fever versus Las Vegas Aces semifinal matchup this year has been a contentious one. Stephanie White, the head coach, has accused referees of flagrant misconduct that may have manipulated the result and is calling for a thorough inquiry. As the skill on the court was overshadowed by a growing number of dubious calls, fans watched in shock. This goes beyond a single game. It concerns the league's own integrity. Did officials really tilt the scales against the Fever, expose a league, and be a coach's breaking point? Stephanie White, the head coach of the Indiana Fever, took a risk that most coaches would never take. The quiet was broken when she spoke out what millions of followers had been yelling at their screens. She pointed straight at the facts, the unbalanced statistics that no one could ignore, in a voice that was full with indignation, yet firm with conviction. Not only was the Las Vegas Aces Indiana Fever free throw differential huge, but it was also ridiculous. The sort of discrepancy that makes a fair competition into a comedy. Disrespect. White used the word, and it had an impact much beyond the news conference held after the game. She encapsulated the humiliation, the injustice, and the mounting suspicion that the athletes on the floor weren't the only ones making decisions in this playoff series in a single statement. Like a razor, the words sliced through the cacophony. Typically, coaches steer clear of this area. They are aware that criticizing referees can result in penalties, suspensions, or worse. Most people carefully dance around the elephant in the room while speaking in coded language. White didn't tiptoe, though. She ran over that imperceptible line. Protecting her players wasn't the only reason she demanded a thorough, league-wide probe. It has to do with something greater: the WNBA's internal legitimacy. The league's very existence is in jeopardy if players, coaches, and fans start to think that officials are influencing or, worse, rigging games. White wasn't by himself, either. The rage was not limited to Indiana's changing room. Social media exploded with proof, indignation, and incredulity across the country. Clip after clip went viral. Phantom fouls in which there was no contact. Obvious hacks that were not reported. Obstacles that were disregarded as though they had never materialized. The actual was on a never-ending loop. The feeling of betrayal gets worse with each replay. On national television, analysts joined the chorus, breaking down plays frame by frame. One commentator paused a video of an Indiana player being knocked to the ground without a whistle to exclaim, "How is this not a foul?" Fans contributed their own edits, slowing down each dubious call and publishing side-by-side comparisons that gave the officiating the appearance of being purposefully biased. It was a chillingly consistent verdict. The formidable Las Vegas Aces, the reigning champs, weren't the only team the Fever faced. The referees themselves were a much more sinister foe. The togetherness of this storm was what gave it even greater strength. Sports disputes typically split along team affiliations. However, even opposing supporters and neutral fans acknowledged that something felt really off this time. One message that went viral said, "I don't even like Indiana." However, this officiating is shameful. In sports, such a broad consensus is uncommon and risky for a league looking to increase its fan base. The basketball community took up the challenge that Stephanie White had put down. One playoff series, one team, or even one season was no longer the focus of this. It had turned into a battle for justice, trust, and the integrity of the market. The WNBA is currently plagued by the question: will the league accept responsibility and rebuild trust? Or will this age of women's basketball be characterized by rumors of favoritism and corruption? There is little doubt that the players are no longer the only ones in the spotlight. The league, the referees, and the unseen force behind the whistles are to blame. What was the action that caused the problem? Which game made Stephanie White furious? Let's examine how the playoffs lost their appeal in more depth. The whispers became roars. Angry press conferences and headlines weren't the beginning. It started off as a whisper, the unsettling suspicion that sports fans share in crowded pubs and living rooms. It didn't feel quite right. Initially, there were only a few dubious whistles scattered here and there. Calls that didn't look sensational yet, but seemed odd. However, those rumors had grown into something far more significant by the time the Las Vegas Aces and the Indiana Fever left the court following Game 3 of the WNBA semifinals. What had begun as skepticism had now turned into a nationwide outcry. This was meant to be a demonstration. On one of basketball's grandest stages, two of the league's best teams, including players who have the ability to define an era, square off. Fans anticipated skill, energy, and the kind of playoff drama that has been immortalized in highlight reels for decades. They received something quite different instead. Who made the game-winning basket or who scored the most points wasn't the main plot point. It concerned the referees, the whistles, the officiating, and the mounting suspicion that the competitive spirit itself had been tampered with. Each foul call felt more significant than the one before it. There was suspicion attached to each non-call. It seemed like momentum was being stolen right in front of Indiana supporters. Even winning was marred for Las Vegas supporters by the persistent rumors that perhaps the balance wasn't in. The court served as more than just an athletic platform. Every property was used as evidence in a trial over the sport's integrity, and it had turned into a courtroom. Fans took note. They witnessed more than just a basketball match. They watched as something came apart in front of them. Doubt was taking the place of trust. Screaming whistles that sounded louder than the ball hitting the floor broke with the sport's natural flow, rhythm, and momentum's natural rise and fall. This wasn't just annoying for WNBA fans who had followed the league for a long time. It was tragic. Because what's left if you can't believe what you're seeing? Social media erupted in flames. Within minutes, hashtags that questioned fairness became popular. Usually careful to steer clear of controversy, analysts alluded to what the fans were already yelling. There was a problem. One game or even one series wasn't the only focus. It concerned the league's legitimacy, the promise of fair play, and the notion that in sports, skill and effort, rather than refereeing, should determine who progresses and who returns home. It was all the more dramatic because the officials themselves remained silent. No satisfactory justifications or guarantees that could quell the commotion. The flames was simply fueled by that quiet. Because when there are no answers, people in sports and in life fill the hole with their own. Fans were filling it with skepticism, rage, and the unnerving conviction that something holy was being tampered with in this instance. There should have been spectacular performances and memorable moments during the WNBA semifinals. Rather, they might be remembered as a watershed, when players, spectators, and the basketball community as a whole were compelled to confront an unpopular subject. Did the athletes still control the game, or had it fallen into the hands of something far more problematic? How much has the competition been impacted by the irregularities? Then, could the true heroes have remained in the background due to corruption? Let's investigate. Stars are protected, heroes are overshadowed. The tenacity, brilliance, and moments that characterize great competition would have been the hallmarks of this series, if not for the cacophony of whistles and dubious officiating. It ought to have been a tale of athletes overcoming adversity, of strategy triumphing over mere grit, or of underdogs standing their ground. Consider Lexi Hull as an example. Notwithstanding her injuries, she entered the hardwood with an untrainable bravery. Her resolve appeared to be evident in every item she owned. Her clutch shots were accurate. Even when her own body cried out for respite, her unwavering hustle elevated her teammates and converted broken plays into second chances. Hull wrote a chapter that ought to have been the centerpiece of this series, embodying resilience in its purest form. Then came Aaliyah Boston, the defensive anchor who made the most talented player in the league a shell of her former self. Boston delivered an outstanding defensive performance while tasked with protecting A.A. Wilson, the current MVP, and an almost unstoppable force. She prevented Wilson from finding her groove by cutting off driving lanes and forcing contested shots. As a result, Wilson had one of his most memorable shooting evenings. Boston's composure and discipline are worthy of being praised in headlines, shown on highlight reels, and used as a model for defensive mastery in the classroom. Together, the Fever demonstrated perseverance. Even though it seemed like their opponents were winning every time the ball bounced, they refused to give up. Their vigor, cohesion, and unwavering resolve demonstrated a team eager to establish themselves as one of the best in the league. Their journey in this series ought to have been remembered as a tale of perseverance, growth, and the unadulterated spirit of rivalry. However, rather than applauding that story, the discussion was taken over. The conversation wasn't dominated by Boston's genius, Hull's bravery, or the Fever's struggle. The officiating was the problem. It seemed that Vegas had more freedom to play than Indiana had. When the Aces had the ball, calls that made every move Indiana made seemed to disappear. Whistles tipped momentum, that fine balance that frequently decides close battles. On one side, stars appeared to be covered in armor, while on the other, the Fever's attempt was smothered by birds that felt unfair at worst and uneven at best. The plot then changed. Instead of being a celebration of the tenacity of a young team, it turned into a tale of frustration. The bravery of Lexi Hull, Aaliyah Boston's defensive prowess, and the perseverance of the Fever as a whole were overshadowed. Instead, concerns about consistency, fairness, and whether the game was actually given room to grow persisted. The audience was entitled to watch a talent competition rather than one that was overwhelmed by officiating arguments. The Fever should be recognized for their courageous, unwavering, and inspirational efforts. However, the attention was stolen in this series. Hull's bravery was forgotten. The sound of the whistle overpowered the Fever's struggle and obscured Boston's authority. Ultimately, the players who gave their all did not define the series. The officiating storm, who wouldn't let the game speak for itself, defined it. Stephanie White made the decision to express her worries. But is this really the first time this has happened? Has there been corruption for a long time? Let's examine the specifics of comparable WNBA problems. The officiating dilemma in the WNBA. The WNBA has a long history of heated rivalry, talented players, and some of the sport's most ardent supporters. However, underlying the thrilling plots and quick-paced action, one problem has persisted: officiating. Players and fans have been silently complaining about dubious calls and missed fouls for years. However, this season, the annoyance has been apparent. What was once discussed on fan forums and whispered in locker rooms is now being yelled from stadia and shared widely on social media. During a recent heated match between the Minnesota Lynx and the Washington Mystics, that annoyance was clearly visible. Emotions were running high, the game was already physical, and every possession seemed to count. Then, as everyone watched, the moment that ignited a fire came. Sonia Citroen, a rookie for Mystic, drove into the paint, obviously taking a lot of damage from DJI Carrington. Although the referee's whistle was supposed to sound sharply and affirm what appeared to be an apparent foul, it never did. Outrage swiftly replaced the startled stillness that followed. Both at-home and arena viewers were in shock over what they had just witnessed. To exacerbate the situation, the referees first called a foul before reviewing the play, then, after carefully examining the replay, dramatically overturning the ruling. You're telling me I have to respect WNBA officials when they go to the instant replay booth and miss calls like this garbage exploit type call? Was the sentiment aptly expressed by one fan on social media. Thousands of people responded to the tweet, which circulated swiftly. For many, it encapsulated their intense annoyance with inconsistency, which has emerged as a recurrent motif. This was more than a single play. There was more than one game involved. It was the culmination of a season-long trend in which players and spectators believe the refereeing has fallen short of the caliber of skill displayed on the court. The last thing anyone wants when top athletes are giving it their all is for the officials to be the focus of the evening's narrative rather than the athletes. However, officiating comes up repeatedly throughout the discourse. Sounds of